The story begins in the early days of the Cold War, a time when the world still trembled from the echoes of a global conflict that had reshaped nations, toppled empires, and claimed millions of lives. The United States, emerging as a superpower, was facing a new kind of threat, a shadow war of ideology, tension, and suspicion that could ignite anywhere at any time. Amid this fragile balance, a man would rise to symbolize both the audacity and danger of unchecked military ambition, General Douglas MacArthur. Charismatic, brilliant, and fiercely confident, MacArthur was a legend long before the Korean War. He had walked the streets of Tokyo and the ruins of Japan, overseeing the surrender of an empire, crafting policies, and becoming an almost mythical figure to the American public. To many, he was untouchable, a hero whose presence alone seemed to guarantee victory. But the world was changing, and even legends could clash with the principles that held a democracy together. By 1950, Korea became the stage for the first major armed conflict of the Cold War. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, had invaded the South, and the United States, under the banner of the United Nations, was committed to stopping the communist advance. Into this cauldron stepped MacArthur, appointed as the commander of all UN forces. His arrival was met with hope and fear in equal measure. He was a man who thrived on risk, who made bold plans with surgical precision, and who demanded loyalty from those around him. And yet, beneath the surface, tensions were brewing, tensions that would escalate into one of the most dramatic confrontations between civilian government and military power in American history. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, faced a country still recovering from war, a Congress cautious about foreign entanglements, and a people weary of conflict yet determined to resist the spread of communism. Truman was a man shaped by experience, deeply aware of the dangers of overreach, and haunted by one of his most vivid memories, Franklin Roosevelt. The late president had wielded power during World War II with enormous influence over military strategy, sometimes bypassing civilian oversight, and while the outcomes of his decisions brought victory, they also left a cautionary tale. Truman, who had served as Roosevelt's vice president and then suddenly assumed the presidency in April 1945, had watched how unchecked deference to military leaders could complicate democracy and undermine the delicate balance between the White House and the generals. He vowed never to repeat what he saw as Roosevelt's mistake, a promise that would soon be tested on the battlefields of Korea. From the outset, MacArthur's approach to Korea was aggressive, almost cinematic in its scope. He orchestrated the daring Incheon landing, a maneuver that many believed impossible, striking behind enemy lines and turning the tide of the war in favor of the United Nations. Newspapers hailed him as a genius, the man who could do what no one else dared attempt. Yet, as victories accumulated, so too did his confidence, and with confidence, a dangerous disregard for limits. MacArthur spoke freely to the press, made bold statements about expanding the war into China, and even hinted at the use of nuclear weapons if necessary. He believed in overwhelming force, in decisive action, and he assumed that his reputation would shield him from political consequence. Meanwhile, Truman watched carefully from the Oval Office. The president understood the stakes. Korea was not just a battlefield, it was a litmus test for America's ability to manage its emerging superpower status. Escalation into China could ignite a world war, something Truman could not afford politically or morally. He needed a delicate balance, strength without recklessness, victory without global catastrophe. The president had inherited a world at risk of nuclear annihilation, and he remembered the lessons of Roosevelt's wartime authority. When military leaders are allowed to act beyond civilian control, democracy itself can be threatened. Truman did not doubt MacArthur's brilliance. He doubted the general's judgment when it strayed beyond the boundaries of civilian oversight. The tension between the two men grew slowly at first, like a storm forming on the horizon. Their disagreement was not over who was winning the battles, it was over who was deciding the war. MacArthur wanted the freedom to operate as he saw fit, unencumbered by political constraints. Truman insisted on civilian control, on the principle that the president, elected by the people, had the ultimate responsibility for war and peace. Publicly, the two maintained an uneasy truce, but behind closed doors, their exchanges were sharp, fraught with mistrust and simmering anger. The general, confident in his legendary status, could not accept being constrained. The president, aware of the potential consequences, could not yield. And so, the stage was set. Truman knew that the lessons of history weighed heavily on him. He knew that Roosevelt's deference to military leaders had allowed certain decisions to slip beyond scrutiny, and he was determined that his administration would not make the same error. But confronting MacArthur was not just a political challenge, it was a personal one. Here was a man beloved by the public, a war hero whose dismissal could provoke outrage, protests, and even congressional backlash. Yet the president understood that principle must triumph over popularity. The question that haunted Truman in those tense months was simple. Could he assert authority over a man who had seemed almost untouchable? And could he do so without fracturing the nation he had sworn to lead? Even as the Korean War raged, Truman worked behind the scenes to maintain unity in the UN coalition, to manage Congress, and to prepare for the possibility of a showdown with MacArthur. Meanwhile, MacArthur continued to act boldly, issuing statements and proposals that directly contradicted official U.S. policy. He communicated with Congress and the press, seemingly confident that his fame would shield him from any reprisal. But Truman understood that the stakes were far greater than public opinion. The credibility of the presidency, the authority of civilian oversight, and the future conduct of American foreign policy hung in the balance. It was a test of leadership that would push both men to their limits, a confrontation that history would remember not for the battles fought on the Korean Peninsula, but for the ideological struggle waged between two powerful men over the soul of a democracy. As winter deepened in Korea, the world waited for the next move. MacArthur, accustomed to audacious victories, could not fathom restraint. Truman, shaped by caution and principle, could not afford to allow recklessness to define America's response. The tension was palpable, the stakes unimaginably high. Across the ocean, on battlefields frozen by snow and hardened by blood, the war raged. But in Washington, a different kind of battle had begun, a battle of wills, of authority, and of history itself. In the coming months, every action, every public statement, every military plan would be scrutinized. Every word spoken by MacArthur in the press, every suggestion he made to expand the war, would test Truman's resolve. And the question that would hang over the nation like a specter? Would the president be able to act decisively against a man revered as a living legend? Or would the same mistakes that had shadowed Roosevelt's presidency repeat themselves, threatening both the war effort and the principles of American democracy? The answer, when it came, would shake the nation, ignite debate, and leave a permanent mark on history. But before we reach that moment, we must understand the full story, the triumphs, miscalculations, the personalities, and the high-stakes drama that set the stage for one of the most unforgettable confrontations in American political and military history. As 1951 began, Korea had become a grinding, relentless battlefield. The initial shock of the North Korean invasion had subsided, and now the war settled into a brutal rhythm of attack, counterattack, and stalemate. MacArthur's brilliant Incheon landing had turned the tide, but it also marked the beginning of the general's increasing impatience with the limits placed on him. He had achieved what many thought impossible, but victory alone was not enough. He wanted total conquest, a decisive strike that would push the communists entirely out of the Korean peninsula. For MacArthur, hesitation was weakness, and compromise was unacceptable. Yet Truman saw the conflict through a very different lens. To him, Korea was a test of containment, not conquest. The goal was clear: stop the spread of communism without igniting a global war. Invading China, risking nuclear escalation, or acting unilaterally was not just reckless, it was a potential disaster that could engulf the entire world. And he knew that allowing MacArthur to pursue personal ambitions unchecked would set a dangerous precedent, undermining the very foundation of civilian control over the military. Every day, the tension between principle and hero worship grew heavier, like a storm cloud inching across the horizon. MacArthur's public statements only intensified the conflict. In interviews, in press releases, even in letters to members of Congress, he spoke of expanding the war into China, suggesting strategies that directly contradicted U.S. policy. He promised victories that were impossible to guarantee, implying that political considerations should not limit military action. And the American public, already enamored with his larger-than-life persona, cheered these bold words. To many, MacArthur was the embodiment of American strength, the man who could end the war decisively if only given free rein. Truman, however, remained steadfast. He understood the power of narrative, of public perception, and the danger of allowing a single figure to dominate both the battlefield and the hearts of the people. The president had lived through Roosevelt's presidency, seen how admiration for military leaders could translate into unchecked influence, and he was determined to prevent the same from happening on his watch. The lessons of the past were clear. Democracy cannot survive if generals answer to themselves rather than to the people who elected their civilian leaders. Behind the scenes, Truman worked quietly but decisively. Meetings in the Oval Office became tense and strategic, with advisors weighing every possible reaction to MacArthur's insubordination. The president balanced diplomacy, domestic politics, and international pressure with meticulous care. He knew that any misstep could embolden MacArthur or fracture the fragile unity of the UN coalition in Korea. Each conversation, each memo, each decision carried weight that went far beyond the immediate battlefield. This was not just a war for territory, it was a war for authority, for the principles that define the American Republic. Meanwhile, MacArthur continued to act as if the rules applied to everyone else but him. He traveled across Korea, visiting troops, giving speeches, and sending reports that often contradicted the policies set by the administration. His charisma was undeniable. Soldiers adored him, journalists revered him, and politicians feared him. To confront him publicly would be risky, potentially catastrophic. Yet Truman knew that inaction was a greater danger. If he allowed MacArthur to continue unchecked, the precedent would echo far beyond Korea, potentially undermining civilian oversight for generations. One of the most dramatic flashpoints came in March of 1951, when MacArthur issued a statement in Tokyo that essentially promised a wider war against China. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through Washington. Members of Congress debated openly about whether to support the general or the president. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, framing MacArthur as a hero constrained by timid politicians. Truman understood that the moment required courage, the courage to act decisively even in the face of immense public pressure and potential political backlash. At the same time, advisors warned him about the domestic fallout. Public opinion was volatile, and many Americans did not yet fully grasp the complexities of Cold War strategy. MacArthur was a living symbol of victory, a man whose very name evoked strength and confidence. Removing him from command could provoke riots, demonstrations, and perhaps even congressional investigations. The president had to weigh the immediate consequences against the long-term principle of civilian authority. Every option carried risk, but in Truman's mind, principle had to win. Democracy demanded it. In private, Truman reflected on Roosevelt's presidency, the mistakes he believed had been made, and the lessons he could apply. Roosevelt's deference to his generals during World War II had sometimes blurred the line between military advice and military command. Roosevelt had trusted, but at times he had trusted too much. Truman vowed not to repeat that. He believed that the presidency was not just a position of power, but a position of responsibility. It was the president's duty to ensure that military force was wielded under civilian oversight, no matter how revered the general in question. The tension reached its peak during a series of closed-door meetings with MacArthur. Accounts from aides and advisors describe the exchanges as intense, almost cinematic in their intensity. MacArthur, with his usual confidence, tried to argue that his strategies required full autonomy. Truman, firm but measured, insisted that the president had the ultimate authority, that civilian control was non-negotiable, and that any military action had to align with the policies of the United States government. The clash was personal, ideological, and historic. It was more than a disagreement over tactics. It was a confrontation between two visions of power, two interpretations of duty, and two very different understandings of what it meant to serve one's country. Throughout this period, reports from the front lines reminded both men that the human cost of war was staggering. Soldiers endured freezing winters, relentless combat, and a political struggle far removed from the realities of the battlefield. Civilians in Korea faced displacement, destruction, and the constant fear of advancing armies. The war was not a distant political game. It was a human tragedy playing out in real time. And yet, the struggle between Truman and MacArthur overshadowed much of the immediate fighting. It became a battle over the soul of American democracy itself, between the glory of military heroism and the restraint demanded by civilian leadership. Advisors debated whether a compromise could be reached, whether MacArthur could be constrained without dismissal. Some suggested stripping him of certain powers or limiting his communication with the press. But Truman understood that such half measures would fail. MacArthur's fame and influence were too great, his willingness to challenge authority too strong. Any attempt at compromise would be seen as weakness, potentially emboldening him further. Truman realized that if the principle of civilian control were to survive, it required a decisive action, a clear statement that no general, no matter how legendary, was above the law or the Constitution. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Truman faced the reality that he was about to make a decision that would shock the nation, divide opinion, and potentially endanger his political future. Yet he knew that history would judge him not for popularity, not for short-term approval ratings, but for his courage in defending the very principles that defined American democracy. The moment demanded clarity, resolve, and a willingness to stand alone against a man who seemed invincible in the public eye. And so, the pieces were set. The war raged on in Korea, the soldiers fought and bled, and the world waited as two men prepared for a confrontation that would resonate far beyond the battlefield. One was a president determined to protect democracy through restraint and principle. The other was a general convinced that victory justified any means, a man whose brilliance and audacity were as dangerous as they were legendary. The inevitable collision between them was about to come, a historic decision that would echo through the corridors of power, the annals of military history, and the conscience of a nation. The moment of reckoning came quietly, almost unexpectedly, yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap. Truman had watched, waited, and weighed every possibility, and now the decision could no longer be delayed. MacArthur's repeated defiance had left the president with no choice. The principle of civilian authority, the very foundation of the republic, demanded action. On the 11th of April, 1951, Truman made the fateful call. He relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command. The news exploded across the United States. Newspapers carried headlines that screamed shock and outrage. Public opinion erupted in fury. Americans were stunned, confused, even angry. How could the nation dismiss a hero, a man who had conquered impossible odds, a man whose very name had become synonymous with victory? Supporters of MacArthur flooded Washington with telegrams and letters. Some demanded impeachment for the president. Others accused Truman of betraying the troops, of undermining the war effort, of letting political considerations override the needs of the battlefield. The tension in the country was palpable, yet Truman did not flinch. He understood the magnitude of his action. This was more than a personnel decision. It was a statement to the world, to the military, and to the American people that no individual, no matter how brilliant or beloved, could operate above the law or outside the chain of civilian command. The principle of democracy, civilian control over the military, was not negotiable. The president's resolve was absolute, even in the face of public outrage. MacArthur, for his part, accepted the dismissal with dignity, but his legend only grew. He returned to the United States to a hero's welcome, with parades, speeches, and adoration from thousands. Congress invited him to testify, where he delivered words that would echo for generations, a powerful, eloquent, and at times confrontational defense of his vision for victory. Yet in private, MacArthur understood the reality. His authority had always been subordinate to the elected civilian, leadership. No matter his fame or achievements, he had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Truman's gamble was profound. He had risked political capital, his approval rating, and even his place in history by confronting a man who seemed untouchable. But history would judge him differently. By acting decisively, Truman reinforced the principle that the presidency, not a military general, ultimately dictates the use of force. He upheld the Constitution, defended democratic norms, and sent a clear message that even heroes are accountable to the rule of law. In the immediate aftermath, the war in Korea continued, but with a recalibrated chain of command. Truman's decision restored a sense of order and accountability to the U.S. military effort. The nation slowly came to terms with the dismissal. While some continued to lionize MacArthur, many began to appreciate the gravity of Truman's choice. It was a lesson in leadership, courage, and the delicate balance between public, sentiment, and principle. The story of Truman and MacArthur is not merely a tale of two men clashing. It is a reflection of the eternal tension in democracies, the struggle to maintain authority, accountability, and restraint in the face of charisma, ambition, and public adoration. Truman's action was a reminder that leadership is often measured not by popularity or applause, but by the courage to do what is right, even when it is unpopular, risky, or misunderstood. Looking back, historians recognize the dismissal as a defining moment in American civil-military relations. Truman had faced a choice that tested every fiber of his resolve: yield to public pressure and allow a general to dictate policy, or act decisively to uphold the principles of democracy. He chose principle, ensuring that the lessons of the past, the mistakes of Roosevelt's deference, would not repeat. The decision set a precedent, a boundary, a line that no future general could cross without accountability. MacArthur's brilliance and audacity remain legendary, but so too does Truman's courage. Both men shaped history in profound ways, but it was Truman who preserved the integrity of civilian oversight. The lesson resonates even today. In a democracy, even the most celebrated figures are not above the law, and the preservation of principles sometimes requires personal sacrifice, political risk, and unwavering resolve. As we reflect on this pivotal moment, the drama, tension, and human cost of leadership come into sharp relief. Here was a president navigating the treacherous waters of war, politics, and public opinion, standing firm against a man adored by millions. And here was a general, acting with conviction, charisma, and ambition, ultimately reminded that even legends answer to the laws and structures that uphold society. The dismissal of MacArthur was more than a historical event. It was a story about power, accountability, and the weight of responsibility. It is a story that reminds us that leadership is as much about restraint as it is about action, as much about principle as it is about strategy, and as much about the courage to make unpopular decisions as it is about victories on the battlefield. Truman's choice echoes through history as a testament to the fragile, essential balance between military might and democratic governance. And though it was met with controversy, outrage, and debate, the lesson remains clear. The preservation of principle, even in the face of immense pressure, is the truest measure of leadership. As we look back on this chapter of history, we see a nation tested, a war fought on distant fields, and a drama unfolding in the halls of power in Washington. And we are reminded that history is shaped not only by the victories of the battlefield, but by the courage of those who stand firm for the values that define a nation. Truman's decision to fire MacArthur was not just about a general or a war, it was about protecting the very heart of democracy itself. In the end, the story is both cautionary and inspiring, a timeless tale of ambition, principle, and the immense weight of responsibility. It reminds us that leadership demands more than vision or brilliance. It demands the courage to make the hard, often lonely choices that history will ultimately judge.